SECfans.com. We did take a longer break than we expected to in the offseason, but we are back in action. This weekend, we've got some games coming up that we're not really going to talk about. It's kind of an hors d'oeuvre before the start of the show, which is the next weekend when the real games kick off. No offense to Colorado State and Hawaii. We are going to do next week, we're going to release a series of shows where we talk about some of the big games in the SEC, maybe touch on a couple of them for kind of our full kickoff into the season. But this is maybe our preseason show. You could call this our preseason show. It does count as one more off-season show. We're going to discuss a few things. One, we're going to rank kind of where we think the teams in the SEC are going to end up at the end of the year, which is, kind of a good fodder for discussion. We're also going to talk in this week, look for the video, a little discussion about the coaches, some of the coaching carousel that went on in the offseason. That's probably going to be our thing we start off with. And then we're going to touch on Shea Patterson going to Michigan. There's a little bit of an SEC connection there, so we figure we talk about it, see what kind of impact he's going to make, if any, in the Big Ten this year. So let's get it started. Once again, everybody's going to smile because the real star of this show, Josh, is back with me for the third season. Gonna get nerdy with y'all, reminding everyone that about 3 or 4 weeks into the season, we start off our computer model, but until then, you just got us. Just us, me and Josh, no computer, and our thoughts alone. So let's kick this off. Let's talk about some of the coaching changes that happened in the offseason, and let's start inside the SEC with Jimbo Fisher coming over from Florida State to Texas A&M. I think there's a lot of people that are maybe down on Jimbo a little bit because of how his tenure ended at Florida State, and I think that's in some ways fair. He had the great year in 2013 with Jameis Winston, got the national championship, and that's nothing to thumb your nose at. He was always a pretty powerful recruiter down there as well. What do you think in terms of A&M? We'll start off kind of from a high level. Just what do you think about that move for them to go out and get him? I know the expectations were high with someone. They're even higher now with a name brand coach like Jimbo Fisher. Do you think it was a good move? Do you think it was a bad move? Or is it yet to be determined?
I certainly think it was a good move. You can't fault any team in college football for going out and getting a guy that's won a national championship, period, right? There's only a handful of them actually out there in college football now. Alabama has a little bit to do with why there's not very many. But Jimbo Fisher knows the South. He knows recruiting in the South. He's consistently produced at a high level. I think a lot of people forget where Florida State was before Jimbo Fisher took over there. They weren't in a great place. They weren't in a great place in terms of talent. They weren't in a great place in terms of productivity. I don't think the culture was all that great either. So, he really turned things around. And if you're Texas A&M and if you have the resources they do, and especially the resources they've invested in their football program, their stadium cost more than the endowments of some of the other universities in the SEC, and that's not even being facetious. It makes sense to go out and get somebody that has a great pedigree. Now, does that mean that he's going to necessarily set the world on fire and be the next Nick Saban immediately? No, I don't think it's fair to ask that. I don't think it's fair to ask for anybody to really succeed at that level. But is he the kind of guy that can win you a national title? Yes. Is he the kind of guy that can get more out of your team? Yeah, I think that's true too. Last season with Texas A&M, I mean, they were talented, and they just as they have been the past several years. But what you saw was a team that didn't really survive down the stretch, and they played Alabama close, and then turned around and beat Florida. Both things that we kind of predicted, at least to a certain extent, because their rush defense had been so good through the early part of the year. But after that Florida game, when they just got curb stomped by Mississippi State and then Auburn, to me, it was just more or less inexcusable. And then in the Wake Forest game, they gave up 55 points. It's like they didn't care, frankly. And I think a culture change was needed. I think they needed to reapproach how they play defense, how their aggression works. I mean, something was clearly wrong because they'd had a pattern of falling flat at the end of the year. So if you were to go around the country, I think Jimbo Fisher's about as strong as you can get. And to anybody that says, well, maybe Jimbo Fisher has this issue or this issue, my challenge would be, who else would you want instead of Jimbo Fisher? Because there's not a whole lot of guys out there that have a stronger pedigree that you can really point to and say, they're better. Maybe Dabo Sweeney, maybe Urban Meyer, but outside the two or three other guys that absolutely 100% weren't leaving their job, Jimbo Fisher is pretty high on that list. In fact, most people would have had Fisher on that list of someone that couldn't even be poached.
So you said something early on that I want to talk about. So eventually, I want to get into some of the X's and O's in terms of where we've been critical of someone in the past and where maybe Jimbo Fisher represents a little bit of a different sort of philosophy there. But before we get into that, I've heard some discussion, and I think it's worth discussing that people felt like Jimbo Fisher had a ceiling on him at Florida State because there was a lack of, or purported lack of, buy-in from the administration there to give him all that he needed in terms of the facilities and the overall athletic department and booster support. I guess to say he didn't have like a Nick Saban blank check. They just announced another ridiculous like $600 million facilities upgrade. I don't think he had that at Florida State. And obviously, if anywhere in the SEC besides Alabama, you're going to have it, it's going to be at A&M. Do you think that he had an artificial kind of ceiling on his head at Florida State, and that could have contributed to him not winning even more there? Was there a limit, or is that just something that fans saying there's really nothing there?
I think there were definitely some restrictions placed on his success by the way they operated. Uh, my understanding was that Florida State was the only national title winning program, at least in the past 25 years, that did not have their own dedicated football facility. That kind of stuff matters, right? They shared their facilities with other programs that didn't have the massive dedicated training complexes and rehab complexes and meeting rooms and et cetera that all the other big time players have. That really hurt him. Now, they still recruited at an extremely high level, so I think you kind of have to take that with a grain of salt, because if there's one way that would have had an impact, it was in recruiting. And when you're still signing classes that, you go back to, let's say, 2016, they were third in the country in 247. Well, actually, I think second in the 247 rankings, third in 247's composite. That's not bad, right? They weren't suffering for players. So they certainly had talent and they overcame a lot of those issues. Now, I've been pretty vocal in the fact that I thought Jimbo Fisher might leave. And the past couple seasons, that discussion centered around LSU, not Texas A&M. And that was because of the facility issues. There'd been a lot of discussion that Jimbo was really frustrated with the fact that they couldn't get better facilities. But I don't know how much that really should have translated to performance, given the fact that they had an extremely high talent level. I think it's a little disappointing that they couldn't beat Clemson with more regularity the past few years, given that they were really consistently more talented, at least in terms of paper and signing classes. But if I were to point to something else, and this is going to be more of a controversial statement, I think there probably were some more ingrained personality issues with Tallahassee and Florida State. They've struggled for many years in getting the most out of their players. I don't know what it is that has caused those issues, but it seems like, if it's Tallahassee or Gainesville, that like strip of Florida, it's just tough to get kids to come in there. I think maybe because of the culture of the area or something. I don't know. But they don't achieve at such a high level, and that's going to be a really controversial remark from a lot of people. But the flip side is, I think College Station maybe is a little better of an environment to put kids into. And I think it really just kind of comes down to the local college scene. And that could be a big impact in Jimbo Fisher's success, because I don't think Jimbo Fisher was necessarily the disciplinarian that some of the other guys were. I've heard he's not quite as organized as some other coaches, and I'm not sure that was necessarily the best thing in Tallahassee. And again, I should be clear, I'm speaking as someone that knows people that live or have lived in Tallahassee. And I think getting away from some of that, much more excited, maybe a little bit of a party college scene is going to be good. And so strangely, I think those things may have been more of a factor with his win-loss success than recruiting, even though those things had to be very frustrating to him because it put a ceiling on, maybe how well he could recruit. In terms of his ceiling wins and losses, I really feel like the inability for the players to stay focused and to really be, disciplined and focused on what they needed to do probably had more of an impact than some of the other external factors that affected recruiting and whatnot.
All right, so last year they were preseason number 2, had that kind of struggle bus game with Alabama. Francois went down late, and it really sort of took the wind out of the team, I think. And then Blackman came in as a freshman, weighing 89 pounds, and just couldn't get it done at quarterback. And we've seen this for a lot of teams, and it's kind of interesting because I think it's somewhat analogous to Sumlin's seasons where there were high expectations. A quarterback coming in with a lot of five-star pedigree couldn't get it done under Sumlin's system, and sort of the wheels came off the bus. So it is a little interesting to me that they would go with a coach who is somewhat live and die by a great quarterback, and we've seen that throughout Jimbo Fisher's career. But talk a little bit for people who haven't maybe listened to us in the past, in terms of your criticisms and my criticisms of Sumlin's offense and how predicated it was on a quarterback, and where maybe that is either the same with Jimbo Fisher or if it's somewhat alleviated.
So, and as you noted, we'd been critical about this for a while. Sumlin's system could be extremely explosive. It could be extremely difficult to defend, but it was very, very difficult to get the correct pieces in place in order to do it. His system, to me, even though they kind of come from different trees and they're different in a lot of ways, I see a lot of similarities between the way it works and the way sometimes Petrino's offense worked, in that it uses a lot of deep patterns, a lot of deep crossing routes, and a lot of progressions, and really asks the quarterback to take a lot of time in the pocket for a route to develop and then make accurate throws down the football field. That requires a couple things. The first thing it requires is obviously a quarterback that can deliver the football in an accurate and consistent manner, and make correct reads. And that's, I think, the thing that everybody focuses on. But in my opinion, and I think you agree with this, the thing it asks more of is time. It takes a lot of time for those routes to develop. It takes a lot of time for things to develop down the field. And when you're in those situations and you don't have the time to throw, it doesn't really matter who you put back there at quarterback. They're going to struggle. In Sumlin's first year in 2012, when they came in, guns firing, Johnny Manziel, I think the thing that a lot of people miss is there were actually 3 players on that offensive line that ended up being drafted as a first-round draft pick as an offensive tackle. You had 3 offensive tackles playing on the same line. I remember watching them play Oklahoma the end of that year in the bowl game, and at one point I counted an 8 count before Johnny Manziel had to leave the pocket. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, all the way to 8. I mean, if you count 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, 4 Mississippi, 5 Mississippi, 6 Mississippi, 7 Mississippi, 8 Mississippi, and then get to throw the ball, there's not many teams that aren't going to be effective as a passing team. And when you added onto that the fact that Johnny Manziel was elusive, that bought additional time, it made his offense really effective. The problem since then is, one, you're not going to have 3 first-round draft picks on your offensive line consistently in any place, no matter how high you're recruiting. Nobody does that. And even still, their recruiting wasn't high enough to where they, the last couple of years haven't had a great offensive line in general. They've had 1 or 2 good players a year, but the offensive line really hasn't been complete. And top it off with the fact that you're playing in the SEC, where you have a lot of really good defensive lines that are very disruptive. And then they have the turnover at quarterback, and it was just way, way too much. I mean, you're not going to have all those pieces all the time. You're not going to have an offensive line that can give you that much time to throw. You're not going to have a quarterback that can make decisions that well. And the problem is, if you're running those routes, if you're relying on deep progressions to stretch the field vertically, while that may be great in theory, if you're not ever having the time to actually hit those routes, if they can pin their ears back and come at you and even play close to the line of scrimmage, everything kind of shuts down. I mean, you maybe you hit a big play now and then, but that's kind of led to the results we saw in certain games where they would just get completely destroyed because offensively they couldn't, no play ever really worked. And then your whole offense changes. You become more of a bubble screen offense, just trying to get something going and stretch them, keep the blitz off really is what you're doing so that you have more time to throw. And it all really falls apart. I think to the second part of your question, really, what does that lead into? Is Jimbo Fisher really that different? I think that's going to be the interesting question here. I do think Fisher isn't as aggressive as Sumlin is. I don't think he asked as much for this offense, but it is going to be interesting because like you said, they pulled in a guy that is also kind of dependent on this downfield deep passing game, a guy that struggled last year because the passing game wasn't very effective and his team was frankly terrible at Florida State because of it. And it kind of seems like you got a lot of the same problems that you're getting rid of.
One last thing before we move on to our next coaching discussion. I think the fans there at A&M have come to expect a bit of a hot start from new coaches, and especially with Sumlin. He kind of caught lightning in a bottle with Manziel, but he still built some consistency there. Knowing what you know about Jimbo Fisher and where you feel his strengths and weaknesses are, excuse me, do you see him this year being one of those coaches that kind of kicks the door open and really turns things around and makes a name for himself season one? Or is he kind of that slow burn coach that gradually builds up to a crescendo and A&M fans need to be patient for a couple, 3 years?
I don't know that it'll take a couple, 3 years, but I could see it taking 1 or 2. I mean, I could see consistency. I could see them coming out and having a more solid campaign than they had in recent years. Something like 8-4, 9-3, I think is absolutely doable. I don't think they're going to come in like Sumlin did year one and blow the doors off, just because I don't see the talent on the squad to do it. Nick Starkel is a pretty serviceable quarterback, but not much more than that. Cullen Mond is really rough, and you're not going to have enough consistency to win at an extremely high level with him. And then when you go down the roster, and they just lost too many guys that were really important. You're not going to get better by losing Christian Kirk, right? You're not going to get better by losing Armani Watts. And I just think that really, and to me, it's actually maybe more defensively than offensively. They need to fill some pieces. There's some really good recruits on that team, right? There are some really good players that someone brought in, but it's not a complete squad. There's a lot of holes. They're not very physical on the defensive end. It's going to take probably a couple years of strength and conditioning and a change in culture to get them where they need to be to hold up for an entire season on the defensive side of the football. And they need to really get a little better at being established in the run and being a physical football team to have balance. So I think I could see them maybe next year taking a big step. And this year, again, maybe having an 8-4 type season where you think it's solid. Maybe it doesn't blow you away, but there's a sign that things are at least stable, and then kind of building from there.